Thought question. If you got into a time machine and traveled back to the year 8000 BC, would you be able to tell it apart from the year 10,000 BC? Probably not. It may be the same 2000 years that separate today's iPhones from the Roman version of a text message written on ye old papyrus and traveling as fast as a horse could run. But for most of history before that, humans lived more or less the same way for thousands upon thousands of years. They hunted, they gathered, then they farmed, with whatever tools and materials they could make from stone and bone and antler and wood. And they farmed some more. Settled agriculture in 10,000 BC and settled agriculture in 8000 BC as ways of life don't look very different. But in the ancient Middle East, starting around 3000 BC, that began to change. Seemingly out of nowhere, farming villages became city-states, and city-states became empires. The Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Medes, and the Persians, and scores of others, a succession of empires that ruled around the previously agrarian, rural, not particularly special Eastern Mediterranean from the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. How did they do that? The key was a new superweapon, bronze. It was a new material which made superb spears and shields and swords and armor plate that made previously obscure farming communities into some of the first organized military powers on Earth. For instance, Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century BC made himself master of Mesopotamia by virtually inventing the standing army, which was actually just designed to make best use of the really important invention, bronze. Let's explore that for a bit. The key point is what bronze can do that copper can't. Copper is shiny and pretty and malleable enough to hammer into jewelry and ornaments quite easily. But if you ranked metals in order from greatest to least potential for carnage, copper would come in close to the bottom of the list. It's soft, it can't hold an edge, and if you leave it out in the air untreated, it will tarnish and corrode away into nothing. So in the ancient Middle East, before about the later 4th millennium BC, copper was great for showing off how rich you were, but on the field of battle, you weren't spectacularly better off with your copper spear point than somebody with the old-fashioned flint or obsidian variety was. Copper can be beaten back into shape when it deforms, which flint can't be, but that doesn't do much good in the heat of the melee. Bottom line, if you had a flint spear and you were fighting against copper, your odds were not bad. When bronze came on the scene, it completely changed that equation. The following 60 seconds will explain why. Copper is soft and it deforms easily because on the atomic level, its atoms are arranged like this. It's very easy for sheets or layers of copper atoms to slide past each other. You hit the copper, the atoms move, they rebond quickly with their new neighbors. That ability for atoms to slide and rebond easily is what makes copper so soft and so easy to hammer into new shapes. When you make bronze, it's still mostly copper, but now it's alloyed with anywhere from a few percent to about 25% of another metal, usually tin. Those atoms are much larger than the copper atoms, and although they sit in the copper lattice, they get in the way of that smooth sliding like little atomic speed bumps. You hit bronze and the copper atoms will try to move, but the tin won't let them. In metallurgical terms, we say the tin deforms the lattice structure of the copper crystals. That makes bronze far harder and stronger and better able to hold an edge than either copper or tin can be on its own. Plus, it's corrosion resistant. The real kicker, though, is that bronze could be mass-produced even with the technology of the ancient Middle East. Copper has a melting point well over 1000 degrees Celsius, 1800 Fahrenheit. That is not the kind of temperature that ancient smelting furnaces got to without a lot of work and a lot of charcoal fuel. Add enough tin, though, and the melting point of your mixture drops by 25 or 30%. Still not a trivial temperature to reach, but much easier than copper. Once your bronze was liquid, you could just pour it into molds and cast a dozen spear points or daggers or swords at once, not rather than just hammering copper into one at a time slowly and with great effort. Copper had made decorations, but bronze would make armies. Nobody took up the new technology with more enthusiasm than Sargon of Akkad. Raised in humble circumstances in the 24th century BC, Sargon nevertheless had great visions, and one of those was what he could do with this relatively new material. We know little of the way this upstart Akkadian first became vizier and then seized power from the last king of the ruling Sumerian class. What we do know is that Sargon had an eye for material, particularly for mineral resources. So tell us the inscriptions he left, saying that he conquered the mighty mountains with axes of bronze. That bronze was the key to Sargon's kingdom. In contrast to the usual irregular forces of the time, he maintained a large standing guard even in peacetime, and these shock troops became the core of his army during his frequent wars. The guards numbered 5,400 or so and were armed and armored in bronze, supplied by Sargon's state-controlled bronze workshops. These received copper and tin ingots and melted and cast them into weapons. Each soldier going on campaign requisitioned his bronze weapons and armor from the centrally controlled storehouse and had to return it when he was done, minus any objects left lodged in an enemy corpus. Reasonably well-verified historical records indicate that Sargon's armies made him the master of some 34 formerly independent city-states from Syria to Iran, and made him the master of their income, including the Silver Mountains, whose mineral products must have been vastly useful to the royal treasury. His capital, Agad, became a semi-legendary storehouse of gold and silver and copper and tin and precious stones. Sargon's system became the military precedent for centuries. Bronze was important not just because its mechanical properties allowed for superior maceration of the multitudes, but because the ease of casting it meant that for the first time in history, large numbers of weapons could be made in standard sizes. And standard armament, in turn, meant that Sargon could have them use standard tactics, including some new twists, like a group of men identically armed and armored standing and fighting as one unit. This was a change from the previous mode of warfare, which had mainly involved the kings and nobles rolling around the battlefield in donkey-powered war carts trying to run each other over, while the peasants skirmished with slings, clubs, and other homemade weapons as best they could without much in the way of central direction and lots of running away. Bronze invented the military formation, and with it the semi-professional army. At least at first, the need for bronze to mount an effective fighting force worked to the advantage of the emperors, and the reasons for their imperial success were primarily geological. Copper deposits are common enough that after a while, as the knowledge of smelting spread, anyone with a reasonable degree of wealth could acquire goods and ornaments of copper. But to make bronze requires tin, and even though tin is easier to smelt than copper, it's much harder to find in ores. Tin deposits are rare, and there are virtually none in the ancient Akkadian Empire proper. Sargon and his successors could have had little tin mined from tin oxide ores or cassiterite in river placers along the Tigris and the Euphrates. But there's not much there, and to equip all of his guards, the Akkadian emperor probably had to have tin traded in from the mountains of Persia or Anatolia, where deposits do occur. Although long-distance trade was arduous, difficult, expensive, and subject to unplanned interruptions by bandits, weather, or the wrath of Enlil, from Sargon's point of view, that actually gave it one definite advantage. Nobody very far below the rank of emperor could afford to import tin. That left his government in virtually complete control of the supply of the one key ingredient necessary to convert soft, shiny, easily deformable copper into weapons-grade bronze. Like any successful idea, bronze weapons and the formation fighting that they enabled caught on around the region and over the centuries. But in an ironic turn of fate, the technology would at long last help destroy the system that it had been adopted to perpetuate. Sargon's bronze-equipped army fighting in formation did make him, as he put it, king of the world. His grandson Naram Sin, with yet greater modesty, preferred to be known as king of the four quarters of the world and god of Akkad. Bronze made them powerful, and they knew it. But the later kings found their power beginning to shake along with their control over the tin supply. Trade was growing around the ancient Mediterranean, and as it grew, more people could acquire tin from more geological sources. That put bronze in more hands, and not always the hands that worked for the kings. More than 1,000 years after Sargon, Greek hoplites, then Macedonian phalanxes, and Roman legions would fight not for one man's empire, but for their own power as citizens, first with bronze, then with iron. Like most military technologies, bronze weapons in the long run would cut two ways.